In previous videos, I've looked at tutorials looking at specific parts of programming, and that's all well and good if you're looking to solve a particular problem within programming. But actually, of course, ultimately what you want to do is put a game together. And putting a game together is very different to just programming a single aspect of a computer game. And so I thought what I would do is a series of posts looking at putting together a game from scratch, right from the beginning. And I try and take you through the thinking that goes on, or at least goes through my mind, when I'm trying to put a game together, because there's all sorts of subtle things to think about that if you're coding in isolation on a particular task, you never naturally need to think about. But in reality, when you're putting a game together, there's a lot of little things to think about. So what I thought I would do is just some sort of simple vertical shooter. So I set in space, I think. So I've got some stars coming down like this, down the screen. I'll have some asteroids that you've got to try and dodge. Okay, sort of floating around in space. The spacecraft is going to be down here at the bottom, shooting upwards. It can shoot bullets, and maybe there'll be some enemy spacecraft that will shoot at me at the same time, or something like that. So we'll see how we get on. That's the sort of thing I'm roughly going to do. I'll probably have a score up in the corner there, maybe a collection of lives on display up this end as well. And ultimately, of course, I would want a menu screen. I'd want the game. I'd want a game over when it's done. So that means I'm going to need some sort of method of switching between these as well. So each and every one of these individual things is available in terms of tutorials, either mine or other people's tutorials, or you can just experiment with things. But putting it all together is a slightly more complicated affair. So let's have a look at what we're doing here and see if we can get on and do anything. Now, as a word of warning and a sort of caveat to everything that I'm doing here, I've not actually programmed this yet, so I have no idea whether things are going to go right or wrong. But I have got an idea of what I want to do in my head, but there's a good chance things will go wrong as I type it. I'll get the code wrong or whatever else. So don't just keep pausing the video and type in the stuff that I type, because there's a good chance that it's just going to be wrong, and then it'll just curse me because I've got it wrong. But suffice to say, hopefully I'll fix it before the end of the video. So let's have a look. First thing to think about really is how I want my spacecraft to move. One of the things I tend to find if you're coding a game is that I like to work on little bits at a time and check that I can get things to work nicely. So I thought the first thing I might want to look at here is the movement of the spacecraft, because that's really going to be crucial to everything. And I think very much I don't want it to be a direct movement in that if you move a key, the spacecraft moves one way, and then if you move the other key, the spacecraft goes the other way. I think that wouldn't be a very realistic method of moving. So instead, what I think I'm going to have is a method where you apply force to the spacecraft and it drifts to one side or the other. And this is something I've done in the past and it's worked quite well. So hopefully we'll try and get something like that animated. Obviously that also means I'm going to need to draw some sprites for the spacecraft. So first of all, I'm going to draw a couple of spacecrafts. So let's see if I can get something drawn here that's going to look like a spaceship. We'll have to see what sort of thing I can put together. The great thing I find about Pico-8 is because there's not very many sprites, or not very many pixels, sorry, on a sprite, you can probably end up with something looking quite good. Here we are. Well, I say quite good, at least not awful. Let's have a look, something like this. Here we go. So there's a spacecraft. That's not a terrible spacecraft and really is just made up of a series of dots in an 8x8 sprite. Okay, so there's a spacecraft that we can move around on screen. And it's important to remember it's sprite 1. Okay, so let's put in an init function. Okay, now there's a good chance that this is not going to become my game. Okay, I think that's really, really important. I've seen people trying to program games and soldiering on with the same bit of code that they started on weeks before. Okay, and it only leads to misery and tears. It really does. It's just not worth going down that route. Code something, test it, put it to one side. Save it, but put it to one side. Don't spend so long trying to polish it. It's just depressing. So just code what you want to code and try it. One of the things to say is that ultimately in this game, because I want a menu and all sorts of other things, I can't literally program update, init, draw and hope that it's going to work. I'm going to have to implement some sort of game state system. And so this that I'm doing now is never going to work as the final game. It'll just become unwieldy and complex, and that's something I'm going to deal with further down the line. To begin with, I really just want to get a nicely functioning movement of my spacecraft, and maybe some scrolling background as well. We'll have a look at that if there's time on this video. Otherwise, that's probably something I'll look at next. So to start with, we thought we would have the spacecraft moving horizontally across the screen. Okay, so that means I'm going to have to control the X location of the spacecraft. So I'm going to call it PX for player X, and I'm going to put him in the middle of the screen to start with. I don't think the spacecraft is going to move up and down, but there's no harm in just giving me a value, so I'm going to make the player Y 100, okay, just for the time being, and it may be that I never ever change that, but it's always worth putting things into variables as much as possible. Okay, so at its most basic, in the draw function, I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm just going to draw sprite 1 at player X, player Y. Okay, so if I run this, there at least is my spacecraft. It's not going to move because I haven't coded anything yet, but at least I've got something running. Now the next thing to say is that I'm going to want this spacecraft to move left and right. That means it's got to have a velocity, and I'm going to call that velocity X, and I'm going to set it to 0. And also, when I press a button, I'm going to give that velocity a change. Okay, I'm going to impart a force on it, and I'm going to get an acceleration, and the button and the velocity is going to change. And I'm going to call that thrust. And I'm going to set it to something like 0.1. Okay? So let's get some left and right buttons moving. The left button is 0. So if the button 0, then what am I going to have? I'm going to make the Vx, the velocity x, change by the thrust. Okay? And the same for the other way, button 1. Then Vx plus equals thrust. Let's go away. I don't like spaces like that. Each to their own, but I'm not such a fan. Okay? And then I can just say the player X has the thrust added to it. Okay? Just as a word of interest, I like this style, plus equals, okay, the concatenation of what is otherwise written as px equals px plus bx. Okay, these two are equivalent, but I quite like this. It's short, it's punchy, and actually I think it's more readable than this, but you know, each to their own. You can code it any way you want. So that should now hopefully make my spacecraft move. Let's have a go. Escape, run. So there it is moving one way, and then it can come back, and you see it's got a little bit of a sort of, it's got a rather pleasant move to it. Okay, oh, it's gone. Where's it gone? There we are. Okay, so that's quite nice. One thing I've noticed, I've pressed the button and now my spacecraft's moving together, which is probably a little bit irritating. And also, ooh, it seems to go off the screen, and we probably wouldn't want that either. Okay, so I've got a couple of things to fix there. Let's have a look. First one, I don't want it to move off the screen. So I could wrap, I mean, I'm probably going to wrap all of this in a function at the end of the game. But let's just say if px is less than 0, then, just move the mouse out of the way, then px equals 0, okay, end. And also on the other side, if px is greater than 127, edge of the screen, then px equals 127, end. Okay, so that should hopefully now, oh, I keep doing that, putting the cursor on it, it's very irritating. Let's run that. So now if I go one way, stops, at least it's banged against the edge. If I go the other way, oh, interesting. Right, I've got a couple of things here. This is interesting. Look, I've banged against the edge. I'm pressing the left button. I let go of the left button. Now I'm pressing the right button. Okay, I'm still pressing the right button, still pressing it. Not moving, not moving. Okay, I think what's happened there is this. When I press the left button, I change Vx, okay? Now when I crash against the edge, I can still change Vx. So I'm located at the edge, but my velocity is getting smaller, you know, it's getting more and more leftward. So when I crash into the edge and then I decide to go to the right, I have to go all the way back from -10, say on my speed, back to 0, then back to positive. So I think what I'm also going to want to have to do, okay, is not just wedge it in place, but set Vx equals 0. Okay, so that it just stops that from happening. And on this side, I'm going to have to do something else. Vx equals 0. Okay, so now if I escape and run, I crash, but I can move straight back. Ooh. Now on this side it's quite interesting. Look, because if we look in here, okay, this is one you're probably familiar with, but the XY coordinate of the sprite is here. So on this one I'm measuring 127, but it's on the left hand side of the sprite. So actually I want to check if I'm greater than 120. I think it'll be 120. Let's have a look. So if I move to the right now, that's better. You see how it doesn't go off the edge. Okay, so that just means I'm not now going to bash off the edge. Okay, that's quite useful. It may be when the game starts playing and we test it a bit that actually we want to scroll around the screen, but for the time being I'm gonna go on that. Another thing to say is that I wonder if it's worth having a limit on Vx. It probably isn't, because I don't crash off the screen, so the speed seems to be quite good there. I think you could move around fairly happily shooting like this. I think that's probably, in fact, if anything, that's probably a bit quick. But the other thing I've noticed is that when you run it, if I move, it just drifts until you hit the edge like this. Drift, 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 drift. I'd rather it slowed down, and that's not too difficult to do. What you can do, you can set up a friction. Again, I'm just stuffing everything in variables. If I multiply my speed by a friction percentage, in other words 0.95, so 95%, that means my speed will only be 95% of what it was each turn. So in other words, it'll decrease by 5%. So here I could just say Vx times equals f. Okay, I better do that before the px actually, hadn't I? So here Vx times equals f, and sorry, too much programming in GameMaker as well, where you press F5 to run things, and so I'm flicking between the two things all the time. Right, run. So you see now it slows down. If anything, that's a little bit harsh. I don't know, maybe not. I think I'll leave the I'll leave it at 0.95 for the time being. No, I won't. It's irritating. I'm going to go to 0.97, let's say. Let's run that. Okay, that feels a little bit more pleasant. So I've got a nice movement now, and the spacecraft slows down. And I think that looks fairly nice. I'd also like, thinking about it, when the spacecraft's moving, I'd like it to bank. Sometimes you think about those old-fashioned games, you could make the spacecraft bank one way or the other. So I'm going to have two other sprites here. Okay, I'm going to have a banking right and a banking left. So let's draw something here. So if I copy this, Control C, Control V, what I can do is I can just chop like this, maybe. Okay, maybe chop off a bit at the front, something like that, and this bit maybe. That looks a little bit like it's sort of rolled to one side. And if I copy that and paste it here and flip it, I think the important thing is to make sure, you see this yellow bit here, which is like meant to be the engine. Clearly, it's meant to be the engine. I just want to make sure that's in the same place. Is that? Yes, it is, isn't it? Okay. So, this one is if I'm flying, I've tilted to the right, so I'm flying to the right, which is sprite 2, and here I'm sprite 3 flying to the left. So we're just going to change a couple ones here. If I've pressed 0, which is moving left, then I want to make the sprite 3. So that means I'm going to need a player sprite, which starts as 1. And so down in draw, I have to make sure I put player sprite in place here. Okay, just copy that. And in here, I'm going to set it to moving to the left. Sorry, moving to the left is this one, which is sprite 3. And here, moving to the right, player sprite equals 2. So if we run that, that's to the left, that's to the right. Oh, I need it to reset, don't I? If I'm not touching a key at the moment, So I really want it to not line up. So I want to be to the right, to the left. Okay, so every turn it's going to make player sprite equal 1. So by default player sprite will be 1. If I do anything, I change it to 3 or I change it to 2. Okay, then I apply some speed, then I just check for the edges. Now, to make sure I know what's going on, let's put some comments in. Okay, get input and change sprite and thrust. Okay, here I can say apply thrust and friction, and here check edges. Okay, so hopefully now, because I put this one in, let's have a look, run to that way. Oh, that's better. I'm actually starting to get, it almost looks like it's flying, doesn't it? Oh, when I move left, if you look, because I copied the sprite, the dark bit of the cockpit is at the top. So on my left sprite, which is this one, I just need to flick those around. So I just need this bit to be dark and here to be light. I think I'll do something like that. And I think I might also just darken the engine slightly, and the same there. So let's run it now. There we go. Just a little bit more. As realistic as an 8x8 sprite can ever be. Okay, I think the final thing I might do, I might just see if I can put a little bit of thrust underneath so it looks like the engine's running. Okay, so I'm going to grab, I'm on my map, why am I on map? So I'm going to grab a couple of these sprites, let's say, tell you what, engine jets and things like that start out hot and tend to get cooler as the jet goes on. Okay, so I'll have a couple like this, and then maybe, oh no, that's out of sight, there, there, and there, like that. Okay, now what's important, if I zoom here, they've lined up, you can see, with each of those. But what I want is I want these bottom three, this, just to scroll constantly. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I don't know how it'll look yet. We can adjust the graphics in a second. Okay, so if I want those to scroll, again, because things are going to be changing, I don't want the sprite number to be coded solid when I draw SPR. Okay, so up here I'm going to have also a thrust sprite, let's call it, and that's going to equal, which one? 17 to start with. Okay, and then in my code over here, I'm going to have to change the thrust sprite, extra on there. So that's just going to be T SPR plus equals 1. Okay, so one turn it's 17, then it's 18, then it's 19, then plus 1 will take it to 20, which I don't want. So I'm going to have to, when it gets greater than 19, I'm going to have to reset it to 17. So I just have to say, if T SPR is greater than 19, then T SPR equals 17, end. Okay, and I can draw that sprite, can't I? So I can just go SPR, and I want to draw the thrust sprite. It's always going to be wherever the spacecraft is, PX, but the location of it, the Y, is going to be an extra 8 pixels down because it's underneath the other one. So if I press escape and run now, what's it said? Oh, I'm forever doing this. Then nah. Okay, there we are. That's okay. It's a little bit odd. I might have to just work on that slightly, but it's not a bad graphic. Okay, so there's my spacecraft moving around. So we've got somewhere. Okay, so I'm fairly happy. I think that's a nice left and right movement. We've got a fairly convincing spacecraft. It drifts through space. At the moment you can't see much that it's doing, but I think somebody playing a game with this sort of thing in would think to themselves, you know what, that actually looks like a spacecraft, in the sense that you could believe it was a spacecraft. When you're playing a game, all you want to do is believe that something is happening, and I think with this one you could probably get away with that. So we'll leave that there. I think the next video I'll do in this sequence is going to look at putting the star field in the background, because that's going to be the bit that's really going to suddenly bring everything to life. He says confidently. It may not, but we will see how it goes. Anyway, for now, I hope you enjoyed that. Happy programming.